In 1965, the writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez was driving on a Mexican highway, he tells us, and the entire plot of 100 Years of Solitude came to him in a flash. He rushed home to write, and after 18 months of daily work, he mailed the manuscript to a publisher in Argentina. It's said that he sent it in parts because he hadn't the money for postage to send it all at once. When the novel was published in 1967, it was an instant international success, employing the flawless synthesis of realism and myth that we call magical realism. The novel brought the consciousness of Latin America to the world. Yet, what is the consciousness of Latin America, and what are the origins of this consciousness? What are we to think when we read these opening lines of 100 Years of Solitude? Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Orlando Buenda was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. What, we might ask, for example, is the role of the military man in this culture. How is it that ice is a rarity to be discovered? Time and again, as for example, we turn to Octavio Paz and his celebration of indigenous culture in Obsidian Butterfly, we'll recognize that to fully understand the writers in this section of the course, we must know something of their culture. To begin, as everyone who's ever taken a history course knows, the Western Hemisphere was populated through a series of migrations from Asian mainland. For at least 15,000 years, people in the Western Hemisphere lived in virtual isolation for the rest of the world. And to put another way, while the technical innovations passed back and forth among civilizations of Asia, Africa, and Europe, the peoples of the Americas dealt with the natural environment and with each other on their own in isolation. Two of the hemisphere's most impressive cultural traditions developed in Mesoamerica, that is Mexico and northern Central America, and in the Andean region of South America. Well before 1000 BCE, plants had been domesticated, new technologies had been developed, and trade had begun. Hence, urbanization and social stratification occurred in both regions. Key here are the Olmec people in East Central Mexico and the Shaban civilization in Western Peru. Between 200 and 900 of the current era, the peoples of Mesoamerica created a remarkable civilization. Building on the achievements of the Olmec, the people of what is today Central America and South and Central Mexico developed new forms of political organizations, made strides in astronomy and in mathematics, and improved the productivity of their agriculture. Located about 30 miles northeast of Mexico City was Teotihuacan. At the height of its power, from 400 to 600, this city was the largest in the Americas. With between 125,000 and 200,000 inhabitants, the Teotihuacan city was larger than any but a small number of contemporary European and Asian civilizations. This was a city of pyramids dedicated to the sun and the moon. Gods such as Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent believed to be the originator of agriculture and the arts, was worshipped. The chinampas, or floating gardens, were narrow artificial islands that provided year-round agriculture and thus played an important role in sustaining the region's growing population. While Teotihuacan civilization was gaining ascendancy in the north, the Maya developed an oppressive civilization in the region that today includes Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and southern Mexico. The Maya developed the Mesoamerican calendar, mathematics, and writing. The great palace at Tikal, located in modern Guatemala, still stands. The Teotihuacan and Mayan civilizations flourished in what is called the Classic Era in Mesoamerica, between 200 and 900 of the current era. The post-classical period is usually dated between 900 and 1500 of the current era, and this is the period of the Aztec civilization. As the Aztecs grew, they located their civilization on the shores of Lake Texcoco, the lake that Octavio Paz identifies in the opening of Obsidian Butterfly. The Aztec state grew to a population of approximately 150,000. Theirs was an elaborate aristocracy, agricultural and merchant system. Civilization flourished, and of course it was the success of these Aztecs that drew Hernan Cortes there. In the Americas, the Spanish established a vast territorial empire. A ruthless nobleman, Cortes left Cuba in 1519 with 600 soldiers to assault the Mexican mainland in search of slaves. and to establish trade. When the exposition learned of a rich Aztec empire in central Mexico, Cortes introduced large-scale exploitation and conquest. What the conquistadors didn't accomplish in terms of death by violence, the smallpox did. Within 50 years of Columbus's landing in 1492, the Spanish occupied all the major population centers of the Americas. The smallpox, superior military technology of the Europeans, and the occupation strategy of the Spanish all contributed to what historians call a widowed land. The Americas were open to resettlement from Europe. Early settlers from Spain and Portugal sought to create colonial societies based on institutions and customs of their homeland. Hence, the African slave trade was introduced into colonial Latin American society. At first, African slaves were concentrated in the plantation regions of Brazil and the Caribbean, but by the end of the colonial era, slaves and their descendants proliferated throughout Latin America. Thus, for example, we might fully understand Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen's ballad of two grandfathers, one white and the other black. Nation building would come between 1800 and 1830 in Latin America. By 1800, the examples of the American and French revolutions, along with Napoleon's decision to invade Portugal in 1807 and Spain in 1808, prompted the desire in Latin America for self-government. During this period, Simon Bolivar became the leader for independence movement in South America. Bolivar liberated present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, named for Bolivar, by 1824. Mexico became a republic in 1823, and Brazil achieved autonomy from the Portuguese in 1889. Yet problems with this order, once achieved, persisted. The French invaded Mexico in 1862 and weren't driven out until 1867. And the United States, in its Treaty of 1848, forced Mexico to cede Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. As the Mexican saying observes, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. And from within, Mexico remained troubled. A few wealthy families of Spanish origin, less than 1% of the population, owned 85% of Mexico's land. Tied to this elite were a handful of American and British companies that controlled most of Mexico's railroads, silver mines, and plantations. In 1911, Emiliano Zapata led a revolt against the landowners, and beginning in 1913, Pancho Villa and his army seized land. Zapata and Villa's revolutionary acts paved the way for the Constitution of 1917, which promised democratic reforms in the country. The Mexican Revolution helped the nation forge a sense of national identity, and Mexico seriously took its commitment to land reform, to education, and to social justice. Yet problems persisted in Latin America. Chile's copper, Cuba's sugar, Colombia's coffee, Guatemala bananas, all were controlled from abroad. The largest resort in Havana was owned by the American mobster, Meyer Lansky. Incidentally, for a film treatment of the relationship between Cuba and the United States, you might take a look at Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather and the scenes dealing with the fall of Havana, or Robert Redfield's portrayal of a gambler in the film Havana. Both are fairly historically accurate. Indeed, the situation in Cuba set the paradigm for U.S.-Latin relations in the second half of the 20th century. Prior to 1960, the United States dominated the Cuban economy, and profits went to the United States or to a handful of wealthy Cubans. In 1959, a rebellion, a revolution led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, overthrew the established government, seized U.S. property, and redistributed the land. On an autobiographical note, I remember as a boy in New Orleans in the 50s in the afternoon cartoon program being interrupted by footage of Fidel Castro rolling into Havana on a tank. The revolution was praised by the TV commentator, and I recall that the presence of Castro, and recall this even as a young boy, that the presence of Castro was seen as a very good thing for the people of Cuba. In 1959, writers Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Maria Vargas Llosa all supported the revolution. When Castro, though, turned to the Soviet Union for economic support, the situation changed. In 1961, the CIA launched an attempt to overthrow Castro. The invasion landed at the Bay of Pigs and was defeated, tarnishing the reputation of the United States in the process. The fact, though, that the communist government could come to power in Cuba and throughout the United States energized the revolutionary left throughout Latin America. The United States responded by organizing its political and military allies in Latin America, determined to fight communism. The effects of American intervention can be seen in the overthrow of Salvador Allende in 1973, the president of Chile, who promised socialist reforms to distribute wealth. Richard Nixon, then president of the U.S., worked in Chile to organize opposition to Allende's reforms. President Allende and thousands of Chileans died in the 1973 uprising. And later in these lectures, we'll discuss Isabel Allende's reaction to the military takeover and the death of her uncle Salvador Allende. Even into the 1990s, Latin America continued to be dominated by the United States, and in 1991, perhaps it might be said that Latin America was more dominated by the United States than it had been in 1975. It's no wonder, then, that the literature of Latin America and the Caribbean is often overtly political in nature. In America, as in Great Britain, fiction, drama, and poetry are oriented toward the aesthetic. That's not true in Latin American writing, or not only oriented toward the aesthetic, where the aesthetic and the political are as one. In many ways, the writers of Latin America and the Caribbean rebelled against the European conventions of art. The magic of magical realism, for example, works because the reality represented is that of the people itself, not of a ruling class or not of European conventions of the people or of fiction. And in Latin America, it is common for novelists and poets to write for newspapers. Mario Vargas Llosa, Isabel Allende, Gabriel Garcia Marquez worked as journalists and have not been shy about expressing ideas about politics and art. Many of the writers have been touched by the work of politics. Isabel Allende was forced into exile, as we said before, from Chile in 1973, and both Julio Cortázar and Jorge Luis Borges lost jobs because of their opposition to former Argentinian President Juan Perón. Many of the writers held political office. Carlos Fuentes and Rosario Castellanos, both American ambassadors. Mario Vargas Llosa ran for and lost the presidency of Peru, and of course Gabriel Garcia Marquez continues to work for international human rights. Thus, the writers of Latin America and the Caribbean are often reflections of their culture. They revolutionize their national literatures by means of their deep social concerns.